Cenk Uygur recently sat down and had an interview with Amanda Marcotte, a political writer at Salon. And what was extremely interesting about this interview is that Amanda Marcotte, during this interview, decided to say that she was not a harsh critic of Bernie Sanders and that she was actually supportive of his 2016 Democratic run for the nomination. And when you look back at her record, that is also not the case. And what was another interesting aspect of this interview was that she said that she was also a journalist, and that also brings up another important issue to discuss as well. And all of the articles that I will mention are linked in the bottom, and so is the interview with Cenk Uygur as well. So where do we start with Amanda Marcotte and her coverage of Bernie Sanders during the 2016 primary? And that's where it's interesting to start off, because she basically lied during an interview with Cenk, where she was ones that said that Bernie Sanders was insulted voters, said that Bernie Sanders campaigned and resorted to whining. It was no longer relevant. She also went on to say that Bernie Sanders was turning into a Bernie bro, just like the movement that was proven to be basically a myth, that there was no major sexism coming from Bernie Sanders supporters. So it's really interesting when you hear that individual say that she was a fair critic and actually liked Bernie Sanders. And then she also goes on to say later that Bernie Sanders was performed horribly in the Michigan debate. That was a primary he won, and she did not issue a correction about her misread of it. She just kept on writing about certain issues. And also during the interview with Cenk, she said that she hated to see people compare Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Sadly, she also was one individual who did a lot of that as well, and I have an example of that. So what comes from this is that when someone says that they are a journalist, that there's a big difference between a blogger and a commentator than a journalist and reporter. There is this opinion journalism, which is said to exist, but it says to admit your subjectivity, but actual investigative and journalism to inform comes from the investigative front and objectivity, which is extremely important. And I don't want to spend this whole video critiquing Amanda Marcotte, but it's interesting with the timing of this interview and how ungenuine she was with her opinions and her favoritism for Hillary Clinton, and not only her favoritism, but her outright distortion of Bernie Sanders' record, and when comparing the two and what the movement actually represented. So I wanted to bring that up. But it's also important to remember that nuance is important. Take, for example, the Syria situation, where we recently bombed the country, which was probably ill-advised, as there's been no concrete definition if Assad actually used chemical weapons earlier this month, or who actually used them. Since there's so many actors at play in Syria, a lot of bad actors at play in Syria, and a lot of things that shouldn't have happened, and we should probably be speaking about. Maybe we should revisit our neoconservative foreign policy strategy when it comes to bombing countries, because quite frankly it hasn't worked over the past 30-40 years in the Middle East at all, and has resulted in the deaths of millions of civilians, which is not something that we should be proud of as a nation or country. So when it comes to journalists speaking out and applying nuance, it's important. I also feel it's also very important for journalists to actually admit what their personal biases are, which is something I always try to do when I'm reporting on everything. It leads to transparency. Or because take, for example, the CNN case of the story that they recently ran online, where they wanted to distort what Jimmy Dore had said about Syria. That's not journalism, because they didn't tell their establishment bias and how they want advertisers to get away from new media and go back to legacy media, which CNN is one of the powers in. So that's just something I wanted to talk about today, and there'll be more videos, and I appreciate you listening.